All right, everybody, we're going to start so we can stay on track. We're going to start this afternoon's session, and our first focus is going to be behavior and psychiatric issues. It's a real pleasure to introduce Carrie Bearden from UCLA and the Psychiatry Department. This truly is a bit of a family event. All of you are here as families, and I feel like Carrie's part of my family. She was actually my first postdoc back in at CHUP when I was studying into this work, so we've continued to work together ever since, and that keeps the family atmosphere going. So it's a real thrill to have Carrie to talk here about social and emotional development in 22q deletion syndrome and other factors. I'll let her talk about it.
Thank you so much, Tony. Can everyone hear me okay? Okay, great. All right. So I want to wholeheartedly thank Dr. Simon and Brenda Finucane for organizing this meeting, for everyone involved with Elwyn and at the Mind Institute. I'm really excited to be here today, and as Tony mentioned, I was actually a postdoctoral student of Tony's several years ago back at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia when I was a graduate student at the University of Pennsylvania, and I had a wonderful clinical opportunity to do neurocognitive testing at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, and that was where I met Dr. Moss, and he was my neuropsychology supervisor, and that was where I first started working with children with 22q deletions, and absolutely loved working with these kids and thought that it's such a fascinating disorder to work with and to try and understand. And so I'm really excited to be starting a clinical research program at UCLA now on kids with the 22q deletion syndrome, and so I'll be telling you about some very, very preliminary results we have from that study and some other stuff as well. Okay. So just to briefly go over the topics that I'm going to cover. Let's see. There we go. So I'm going to start out by talking in general what we know about behavioral, temperament, and psychiatric features of this syndrome, and then about questions about the prevalence of autistic spectrum disorders in the 22q deletion syndrome. This is something that has been reported. It's really only been a few studies very recently in the literature, and so I'll talk about that a bit. What we, from findings from our group and others on cognitive and brain differences that have been identified, and then, like I said, some very preliminary findings from our study at UCLA. And then finally, I'll talk about early warning signs for psychosis. That'll be a transition into Dr. Stoddard's talk, and also the importance of early intervention. And I think that's really a theme that's been running throughout the talks today, is early intervention works, and it's very highly recommended. Okay. So brain development begins in utero before children are born, and there are a variety of factors that affect brain development, particularly genes, and environment is a very broad term. What are some prenatal environmental factors that could affect the fetus? Of course, maternal alcohol and drug use is a big one, various other environmental factors, and we don't understand what all these factors are that can affect brain development. But we do know that brain development is critical for cognitive function. The way your brain is structured affects the way a person thinks. And this is a picture of a double helix DNA strand, and so obviously genes are important for the way the brain develops, as I mentioned. And what causes some children for their brain to develop normally, and for some children to go on to develop a neurodevelopmental disorder? And here I'm not talking specifically about 22q deletion syndrome. I'm talking about any what we call idiopathic neurodevelopmental disorder where the cause is unknown. So attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, autistic spectrum disorders, later during adolescence, psychosis. We really don't know what happens during brain development, but we think that it is something about this early prenatal period that is important for the development of these disorders. And so in the case of the 22q deletion syndrome, we actually know what the genetic cause of these psychiatric difficulties is. There is a chunk of DNA missing on chromosome 22. And we know that children with this syndrome have a very high rate of psychiatric disorders. And a minority of children with this syndrome will go on to develop psychosis, so 25 to 30%. A larger percentage of them have it got a little covered, but attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, autistic spectrum disorders, and I'll talk more about that. Also, a larger percentage of them, maybe 40%, have anxiety disorders. And that ranges from things like specific phobia, unreasonable or irrational fear of animals or insects or the dark, and obsessive compulsive disorder, which is a particular type of anxiety disorder. So there's a lot of things that go on in between the level of the genes and the level of these clinical diagnoses. And so at the level of the brain, we have a bunch of things that are going on, and we think that some of these brain features, and Dr. Simon talked about some of these, we think that some of these features are things like decreased gray matter. That's the brain cells, the neural tissue, that is reduced. Anomalous myelination. Myelin is the white matter in the brain. This is the fiber, the coating on the fiber tracts that connects the different regions of the brain that let you process information. And the abnormalities of dopamine neurotransmission, if you've heard of dopamine, it's a neurotransmitter in the brain. And dopamine is thought to be dysregulated or affected in a variety of psychiatric disorders, particularly schizophrenia and ADHD. And we think that these neural features, these things that are going on at the level of the brain, are important for the neurocognitive deficits that we see in children with 22q deletions. So difficulties with time and space, like Dr. Simon was talking about, difficulties with response inhibition and planning. And this is really, when we talk about response inhibition, that's referring to being able to put the brakes on a behavior, to stop yourself from doing something that you want to do. That's something that these kids have a lot of trouble with, as you might have noticed. Planning, being able to plan things far in advance, and that may have something to do with these time and space difficulties. Also, social cognition is an issue, being able to understand other people's intentions and being able to engage in reciprocal social interaction. And so we think that all of these factors, at the level of the brain and at the level of cognitive function, are related to the clinical symptoms that we see. But this is obviously there's a lot of things that go into this pathway, and I'll be talking a little bit more about that. So as I mentioned, in terms of psychiatric findings, the risk of schizophrenia in adults with this disorder is about 25 times the rate in the general population. And an interesting finding from a study at the National Institute of Mental Health was that 6% of children with childhood onset schizophrenia, which is a very rare and severe form of the illness, it turned out that 6% of them had a 22q11 deletion. So I think what this tells us is that when children have a very severe and rare form of schizophrenia, there's very likely to be a rare genetic event that's involved in that. And now psychosis is of course present in a minority, but elevated rates of other psychiatric disorders like attention deficit hyperactivity disorder is present in about 1/3 to half of children with the syndrome. Bipolar disorder, obsessive compulsive disorder, and autistic spectrum disorder diagnoses range from 14 to 50%, depending on what study you look at and depending on the diagnostic criteria that they use. And so I'll explain more about why those rates are so different across studies. The concept of schizotypy in 22q deletion, and so I think that as we've talked a little bit about, early on there's a lot of medical complications and illnesses to deal with all the surgeries, and then unfortunately the psychiatric issues start manifesting a little bit later, and I know that the risk for psychosis is something that a lot of people are concerned about because it is something that manifests later, and so I'll be talking a little bit about some red flags or things to look for that might indicate some risk for psychosis. So in adults with 22q deletion, Ann Bassett's group looked at adults who had schizophrenia and those who did not. And really what her question was is, does schizophrenia in people with 22q deletion syndrome look like schizophrenia in the general population? And the answer was, in general, yes, it does. They had the same types of symptoms. They had delusions and hallucinations to the same extent as people with schizophrenia that did not have the deletion. One of the differences, in fact, the only difference she found, was that there was on the excitement factor score, which was higher in 22q deletion adults with schizophrenia than in regular garden variety schizophrenia. And so this factor is really measuring things like poor impulse control, uncooperativeness, and hostility, and really getting at this mood lability that we tend to see in not just kids with psychosis with 22q deletions, but across the board. We tend to see more mood lability, explosive temper tantrums, and things like that. And I think that's what this factor is really getting at. Now, a study from Stanford by Carl Feinstein looked at kids that were 6 to 19 years old, and what they did that was very interesting, I think, was they compared kids with 22q deletion syndrome to developmentally delayed controls. And so this was an interesting control for IQ. So these were kids that had very similar IQ to the 22q group, and what they found was that rates of anxiety disorder, particularly phobias, and attention deficit disorder were actually similar and very high, about 50% in both of these groups. But where they did find that the 22q deletion group was a little bit different was in terms of these rates of psychotic symptoms, so delusions and hallucinations, as compared to this developmentally delayed control group. And what's interesting is that this group at Stanford actually followed up these kids 5 years later, and they found that among children that developed, that had these that in early childhood had these subthreshold psychotic symptoms, all of those children went on to develop a full-blown psychotic disorder. And so that really suggests that if your child is manifesting some of these symptoms, which I'll talk more about specifically what those are at the end, then that is really something to get involved in some evaluation and treatment. All right, and so again, this is a study that looked at children with 22q deletion compared to their siblings, finding higher rates of psychiatric disorder in the 22q group as compared to their siblings, unsurprisingly. But also, 2 of the 3, and this is a very small sample, of course, but 2 of the 3 of the patients that showed some schizotypal traits later went on to develop schizophrenia. So again, suggesting that if any of these signs are manifesting in early childhood, that it's very important to get into some early treatment. And a study from a British group, Baker and Skews, looked at adolescents, and they used a quantitative measure of schizotypy, which was a questionnaire measure. And what they found was that even in children that did not have a psychiatric disorder or a psychotic disorder, that they had they endorsed a lot of these schizotypal beliefs. So unusual perceptual experiences, maybe seeing or hearing things other people didn't see or hear, unusual beliefs, thinking that maybe they could read other people's minds, and so forth. Those are the types of symptoms that these kids were reporting. And this is a study from a few years ago. It's a small study, it's 16 children, but what was nice about this study was they actually looked at a variety of aspects of temperament in these children, and they found that the majority showed oppositional behavior, some argumentative behavior, also clinging to their parent, so some separation anxiety features, and then again the hallucinations and paranoia or suspiciousness were also present at a pretty high rate. Okay, so what do we know about autistic spectrum disorders? As I mentioned, the rates of this diagnosis are pretty varied across studies, depending on what measure is used to make the diagnosis. There was a study by Wendy Cates, their group at upstate New York, compared, and this was an important thing to do, they compared children with 22q deletion syndrome with autism to children with idiopathic autism, or autism that did not have a known genetic cause. And what they found was that indeed children with 22q deletions and autism looked very similar to the idiopathic autistic group, and particularly in the areas of imaginative play. They had less make-believe play, more ritualistic behavior, so having to do the same thing over and over again. Motor stereotypies, so things like rocking, spinning, and also repetitive use of objects. Those were the symptoms in particular where these children were really showing similarities to another autistic group. And one of the questions, I think, is whether autistic spectrum disorders are a risk factor for future psychiatric difficulties, because autistic spectrum disorders will typically get diagnosed when children are pretty young because of the language component of this disorder. But we really want to know, what does this mean for future development, and do these diagnoses continue, or do the kids sort of grow out of them over time? And we don't really know the answer to that yet. So this is a study that was actually done when I was back at Penn and CHOP, looking at the psychosocial profile, and this is the childhood behavior checklist, which is a pretty well-known and widely used parent report measure of social competence and emotional adjustment and we looked at, this was in 31 kids with the deletion. And essentially, and these are average scores, and so a score over 60 represents a score in the at-risk range. And so what you can see is that, and these were children that, for the most part, did not have a particular psychiatric diagnosis. None of these children were psychotic, but but across the board, children were showing average scores in the highly clinically significant range, particularly in the areas of social problems, thought problems, and attention problems. And they also showed slightly lower, but anxiety and depression and withdrawal, so some of these internalizing symptoms that were also in the clinically at-risk range. And so I think, again, this points to that intervention for some of these social problems and attention problems is probably in order for the majority of children with this syndrome. Okay, so as I mentioned, there's some discussion about what percentage of children with 22q deletion actually meet criteria for an autistic spectrum disorder. So why is this so controversial, and what is this debate? Well, I think when we look at the criteria for autism, it will make a little bit more sense. So, Brenda really went through an excellent overview of the symptoms involved in autism earlier this morning, so which is great, so I won't go into too much detail about that. But there are basically three major clusters of abnormal behavior in autism. And one of these is language, social behavior, and repetitive restrictive behavior. And so if you are within a certain threshold of so-called abnormality across these three domains, then it meets criteria for what we call narrow phenotype autism. Now, children with 22q deletions, very often, I mean, probably almost all of these children have early language delays, and then the majority also do have problems with some social behavioral problems, and so you can see why they're going to be fulfilling some of these criteria. Now, as Brenda mentioned, Asperger's is very similar to autism. Whoops, let me go back to Asperger's. Is very similar, but it may not be diagnosed till later because the children do not typically have the severity of language delay and the severity of cognitive difficulties that children with a diagnosis of narrow phenotype autism have. And so these kids are more in this area. So they may have things like, they have some abnormal social behavior, they have problems making friends, and some repetitive and restrictive interests in particular. So, for example, being really, really interested in train schedules or, let's say, vacuum cleaners or something like that. Those are some typical ones. Just with a very narrow frame of interest. And then, as Brenda mentioned, pervasive developmental disorder, NOS, is a diagnosis that's basically like, well, they have a lot of the features of autism, but they really don't quite make the full criteria. But they have some of these traits across all of these domains, typically. And so, again, I think I'll just go through this really quickly since Brenda covered the symptoms of pervasive developmental disorder. But in the social domain, poor regulation of social contact, limited social emotional reciprocity. So they can tell you about their interests, but they can't really ask you a question about, how was your day, or really being able to formulate an appropriate question for another person or figure out what another person might be interested in. And then that's related to some of the communication problems, and then again repetitive behavior. So I'll go through that quickly. So now that I've talked about some of the symptoms, I'm going to talk a little bit about what some of the cognitive factors are that may be related to this and some of the experimental paradigms that we've used to look at this. And this is actually data that I collected with Dr. Simon back when I was at CHOP. This is the post-neurotensional cueing task. And so this is a task where, if you remember from Dr. Simon's talk, he was mentioning if you have an exogenous cue that's out there pulling your attention versus an endogenous cue, or a cue that's sort of central. This is a task with an endogenous cue that's in the middle, and so the cue that you see in this task is an arrow that's going to point to either the left or the right. And then the person's job when you're performing this task is you have to press the button. Press the button on the left if you see if the cue appears on the left, if the target appears on the left, and press the button on the right if the target appears on the right. And you have to do it as quickly as you possibly can. And so that cue can be valid if it points to the location where the target will subsequently appear, or the cue could be invalid and it points to the location and then the target appears over here. And what's interesting is that this is a task of what's called spatial attentional shifting. And what's interesting is that people that have lesions in their parietal cortex, so this part of the brain over here that's important for visual spatial function and math, they are markedly impaired on this task. They really cannot do it, particularly if this is an invalid cue. They cannot shift their attention away from where that cue pointed them to. And what's interesting is that children with autism also have great difficulty doing this type of task. So once their attention is allocated over here, they can't refocus it to look over here. And people with schizophrenia, interestingly, also have difficulty with this type of paradigm. And so we looked at this in kids with 22q deletion syndrome. This was 38 kids and 35 typically developing controls. And this is reaction time is on the x-axis. And so the kids with 22q deletions are here with the open circles, and so they're slower overall. That's not too surprising, but what's interesting is that compared to the controls, they really showed a differential impairment when it was an invalid cue condition. So when the cue pointed them to look in the opposite direction, they really couldn't reallocate their attention and shift their attention away. So in the absence of facilitating information, it's really hard for them to direct their attention appropriately, and I think this is an important point for intervention as something to, I think it's important to not only understand what's globally problematic, but also at a very specific level, what are the particular things that are really difficult for these children to do. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about some of our magnetic resonance imaging findings. And so this is a brain, and this is the cortex of the brain. And so my colleague at UCLA, Paul Thompson, developed a method for looking at the thickness of the cortex in millimeters. And this can be done. What's really amazing is this is the kind of thing that in the past really had to be done post-mortem, so with someone who had died and you could measure it. But now with these new computational algorithms, this can all be done with a non-invasive MRI scan. So basically, you take a picture of the brain with an MRI scanner, and then you can do these post-processing of the scan and then get these very detailed measurements of how thick the cortex is, which is neat. And so let me explain to you what we're looking at here. So this was an MRI study. And this was data we collected at Penn, actually, but children with 22q deletions compared to typically developing control children. And so these brains, these colorful brains that you're looking at here, you can basically think of this as the average brain of the 22q deletion group overlaid on top of the average brain of the control group. So, and the regions that are where you see the red and the white colors, these are the areas of greatest deficit in the 22q deletion kids. And so fortunately these data are, I think, very consistent with what Tony has showed you. So what we found is that the cortex was markedly thinner, particularly in these parietal occipital brain regions, these brain regions that are important for doing mathematical calculations and for visual spatial cognition. And then we also found this localized area of thinner cortex this is a brain region called the inferior frontal gyrus, and this is a brain region that's important for language development, and it's also important for reciprocal social interaction. So I thought that what's interesting here is that these findings on MRI really map very nicely onto the cognitive patterns that we see. So I think at that level we are seeing a neural substrate or a neural explanation for what's going on at the cognitive level. as Tony mentioned, a lot of these, the deficits in the brain that we see are at the middle of the brain. And so this is a picture of basically if you are standing sideways and you cut the head in half, this would be what you would see. So this is the corpus callosum. This is the major white matter fiber tract in the brain that connects the two hemispheres of the brain together. And so what we saw that was quite interesting, I think, again, we're seeing the red and white are showing the areas of greatest cortical thinning in the 22q group. And so you can see that in this parietal occipital cortex, these brain regions that are important for visual spatial navigation, these kids are showing the greatest cortical thinning. But the other regions we saw a lot of cortical thinning were the anterior cingulate, which is a brain region that's critical for attentional control. And this is called the subgenual prefrontal cortex, and this is a brain region that's critical for emotion regulation. So I think that this is interesting how well these brain findings map onto the difficulties that we see both in cognition and in emotion in a lot of these children. And Tony also mentioned some findings about looking at gyrfication differences, and this was using a slightly different methodology, but we looked at the pattern of cortical gyrfication. And so the gyri, as Tony mentioned, are these little convolutions on the surface of the cortex. And there's a disorder called polymicrogyria, which is sorry, I just found out I only have 5 more minutes, so I'm going to wrap this up quickly. But polymicrogyria is a disorder that's it's a rare manifestation of 22q deletion syndrome. But even none of these kids had that severe of a manifestation. None of these kids had these very, very tiny microgyri, but they did have this increased pattern of gyrfication in the posterior brain regions. And so this really suggests that something is going on during very early cortical development, and probably this deletion is affecting neuronal migration. It's affecting the way the neurons migrate to the cortex of the brain, and this is causing some of these cognitive difficulties. And we found that these gray matter, or the amount of brain tissue you have, was very highly correlated with full-scale IQ, particularly in these children with 22q deletion. There's a very strong relationship. Okay, so I'll tell you quickly about the study that we have. We've just started at UCLA. It's called The Neural Basis of Autistic Spectrum Disorders and 22q deletion syndrome, and this is a copy of our brochure. We have brochures out front, and my graduate student, Lori Brenner, is also here, and we'll be happy to tell you more about the study and what we're doing, and if you're interested in signing up, that would be great. The study procedures, we do a lot of different things. Cognitive assessment, we do a pretty in-depth evaluation for autistic spectrum disorders. We do the ADOS, which is a parent-based interview measure, as well as the the ADOS is a behavior measure of the child, and the autistic diagnostic interview, the ADI, is the parent interview. It's a pretty intensive interview, and this is really the gold standard for autistic spectrum disorder diagnoses. We also assess for other psychiatric disorders with a shorter interview, the C-DISC, and we do MRI, and we do a variety of questionnaire measures, which I can certainly tell you more about later if you're interested. And then we collect DNA as well as RNA, which is looking at gene expression. And so theory of mind is one of the measures that we are particularly interested in, because this is known to be very impaired in children with autistic spectrum disorders. This is defined as the ability to represent others' mental states and use social cues to interpret others' behavior. And this really hasn't been studied in children with 22q deletion. But we're starting a study of this, and I actually won't show you the task now, but it's basically looking at little animated triangles, and sort of you're attributing some social intentions to these triangles. It's a very interesting task. And let's see, there we go. So let me just tell you some very early findings from our study and some common themes. The children pretty universally tend to report a social withdrawal, social problems, and that they would rather be alone, some difficulty making friends. Also some sensory symptoms like hypersensitivity to sound is coming up a lot. Restricted interest in getting stuck on one topic. These things may sound familiar to some of you. Difficulty with transitions, arguing with parents at home, attentional problems, and also some phobias. And I'm going to tell you in the last couple minutes, and this will be just a transition into Joel's talk next, about factors that might predict future psychiatric problems. So this is a study of not of children with 22q deletion, but of people that were at clinical high risk for developing psychosis. And in this study, what they found, this is in a very large sample, and what they found was that the factors that most highly predicted subsequent conversion to a full-blown psychotic disorder were genetic risk, in other words, having a family member with a first-degree relative with a psychotic illness, with a recent decline in function, so doing more poorly in school or work, unusual thought content, suspiciousness or paranoia, and poor social functioning and any drug abuse. So these are the factors that really uniquely predicted subsequent conversion to psychosis. And I think Joel will be telling you more about exactly these symptoms in a moment. So just in terms of what to look for, some red flags, suspiciousness, children reporting that people might be talking about them in a negative way or watching them, unusual thinking, not being able to tell whether something's imaginary or real. And these are some things that you can ask your children about, because a lot of times kids don't talk about this stuff, and that's a really important thing. They often don't talk about it unless somebody asks them. Some more perceptual disturbances, so things like at a severe psychotic level, these are things like seeing things that aren't there, complete hallucination. But at a lower level, it's things like increased sensitivity to light or sound, seeing things out of the corner of your eye or shadows out of the corner of your eye. So again, this brings us back to the topic of early intervention. Careful, frequent monitoring. Make sure you ask your children about whether they're experiencing these types of things. And psychosocial treatments, I certainly wouldn't advocate psychiatric treatments unless they're particularly indicated for a particular disorder. But psychosocial treatments can be very beneficial. Social skills groups, things like that, really I think across the board can be beneficial. Using medications with caution. You don't need to see somebody who's a specialist in 22q, but you do need to see someone who will listen to you and who's willing to learn about it. And having a supportive family environment is really critical, particularly during this critical adolescent period. And so again, importance of early intervention. The severity of the intervention and the invasiveness of the intervention really scales with how far along the disorder is. So in other words, if you intervene earlier, you can do less invasive treatments. And this is an example from general medical practice for diabetes, things like diet and exercise as opposed to, or for cancer, for example, things like diet and exercise as opposed to surgery. So in that sense, I think the same analogy can be applied to psychiatric treatments. So just to summarize, it is pretty clear at this point that children with 22q are at increased risk for a variety of psychiatric symptoms. The mechanisms really aren't well understood, but it likely involves a cascade of neurodevelopmental events occurring with early brain development, and we don't really know what happens during adolescence that might lead to the development of psychosis, but we're hoping to find out. And again, poor social function is very common, although we don't really understand the changes in development that occur over time. But early intervention, again, is critical. And I just want to thank all of my colleagues, both at CHOP and at UCLA. And then none of this work could get done without all of you, without all the families. And so I really want to thank you for all of your participation. And that's it.